You stand now in the hollow echo of the Piazza Venezia, Rome, 1934. The air is thick, not with the smell of jasmine and old stone, but with the cold, metallic scent of absolute ambition. Beneath the balcony, where the self-proclaimed Il Duce, the leader, stood, you feel the weight of a million eyes turned upward in compelled adoration. This was the stage where Benito Mussolini performed the grand illusion of the strong man, a man who promised order from chaos, yet delivered only the systematic demolition of the human spirit. How quickly, you must wonder, does the yearning for stability transform into the acceptance of tyranny? He wasn't a king descended from ancient gods, but a former teacher and socialist who masterfully used disillusionment as his greatest weapon, turning the trauma of war into the foundation of a dictatorship. We look not just at his acts, but at the psychological architecture of the state he built, one brick of fear at a time. The story begins in the aftermath of the Great War, a time when Italy felt betrayed, left with a mutilated victory. This feeling of national grievance, of deserving more than they received at the negotiating table, was the precise strain of fuel that ignited Mussolini's fire. You can almost hear the roar of the crowds as he spoke of restoring the Roman Empire's ancient glory, an intoxicating blend of future promise and historical myth. But beneath the patriotic fervor and the promise of trains running on time lay the nascent violence of the black shirts, the squadristi. These were not mere political thugs. They were the shock troops of a new political philosophy, using targeted, localized conflict against opponents like socialists and union leaders. They were the visible threat, ensuring that the political chaos of the streets was replaced by the disciplined terror of the regime. Mussolini's march on Rome in 1922 was not a military conquest, but a calculated display of strength, a psychological seizure of power that the weak central government and the king allowed. You watch as he enters the city, not at the head of a conquering army, but summoned legally to form a government. This is the crucial, chilling irony of fascism's birth in Italy. It climbed to power using the very mechanisms of democracy it intended to destroy. Within 3 years, through a combination of legal manipulation, like the Acerbo law, which guaranteed fascists a 2/3 majority, and violent intimidation, the transformation was complete. The office of prime minister became the throne of Il Duce, and Italy became a laboratory for totalitarian control. The immediate casualty of this consolidation was the political opposition, silenced not by direct war but by targeted removal. Think of Giacomo Matteotti, the socialist deputy who dared to publicly denounce the electoral fraud of 1924. He vanished. You hear the whispers in the cafes and the silence in the parliament halls. The truth of his fate was known even before his body was found months later. This act, the assassination of a prominent political critic, marked the point of no return. It showed that legal immunity meant nothing when challenging the regime, forcing every other voice of dissent into exile or into the suffocating, silent fear of self-censorship. The real danger of Mussolini's regime lay not just in its visible cruelty, but in its all-encompassing reach. The fascist state understood that to control a nation, you must first control memory, identity, and the imagination of the child. Education was swiftly repurposed. The youth organizations, especially the Opera Nazionale Balilla, were designed to indoctrinate children from the age of 6, blending physical discipline with ideological fervor. You see the children marching, singing the praises of Il Duce, taught that the individual exists solely to serve the collective will of the state. The ultimate stake here was the next generation, a population stripped of critical thought, conditioned to believe, obey, fight. The most potent weapon against unseen resistance was the creation of the OVRA, the Opera Volontaria per la Repressione dell'Antifascismo, established in 1927. This was Italy's secret police, a name deliberately chosen to sound harmless, yet responsible for weaving a vast, invisible net of surveillance across the country. Imagine knowing that any casual conversation, any unguarded word in a tavern or a private letter could be reported by a neighbor, a colleague, or even a relative. The OVRA specialized in psychological repression, utilizing a staggering network of informants, estimated to be nearly 100,000 strong. This created an atmosphere where trust withered, forcing all political thought inward, ensuring compliance through absolute fear of the unseen eye. As the years advanced, Mussolini's domestic domestic tyranny began to manifest on the international stage, fueled by his desperate need to prove Italy's place among the great powers. The moment of deep irony arrived with the invasion of Ethiopia in 1935. Italy, a signatory to the League of Nations, launched an unprovoked, brutal war of colonial conquest. You stand alongside Emperor Haile Selassie as he addresses the League of Nations in 1936, his voice a tragic prophecy. It is us today, it will be you tomorrow. This was not just a military expansion, it was a moral abandonment that echoed through the coming global conflict. The conquest of Ethiopia was stained by systemic, unforgivable violations of international law, notably the widespread use of chemical weapons. You trace the historical record: mustard gas deployed from aircraft, targeting not just military positions, but villages, water sources, and field hospitals. This was strategic cruelty, a deliberate attempt to break the will of the populace through sheer, indiscriminate terror. While the Western world wrung its hands, failing to act decisively, Mussolini proved that the League of Nations was a paper tiger, accelerating the world's slide toward global conflict. He was testing the boundaries of what the world would permit a strong man to do, and the world allowed it. The ideological trajectory of fascism found its darkest convergence in 1938 with the introduction of the racial laws, leggi razziali. Until this point, Italy's small Jewish community had enjoyed centuries of relative integration, but in a desperate attempt to align himself fully with Nazi Germany and deepen his regime's grip through manufactured scapegoating, Mussolini embraced anti-Semitism. These laws systematically stripped Italian Jews of civil rights. They were barred from public education, government jobs, the military, and professional life. You witnessed the sudden, shattering betrayal felt by a community that considered itself entirely Italian, now officially designated as foreigners by the state they served. This betrayal was enforced with chilling bureaucratic efficiency. The OVRA and local police forces were instrumental in implementing these decrees, charting family trees and professional lives. The emotional cost was immeasurable. Livelihoods instantly dissolved, families facing forced separation, and the looming threat of further isolation. This period is a haunting reminder of how easily a powerful state can turn on its own citizens, not through sudden violence, but through the cold, calculated stroke of a pen. 10 years after the March on Rome, the promised order had mutated into a system that mandated cruelty and legalized the destruction of dignity. Mussolini's final, disastrous gamble was his entry into World War II in 1940, betting on a swift German victory that would grant him a seat at the spoils table. The gamble failed spectacularly. Italy's military campaigns in Greece, North Africa, and on the Eastern Front were plagued by outdated equipment, logistical failures, and poor planning. You feel the weariness of the Italian people as the promised glory evaporated, replaced by rationing, casualty lists, and the first Allied bombings of Italian cities. The cult of Il Duce, so meticulously constructed by propaganda, began to crumble under the weight of tangible defeat. Disracoint arrived in 1943 with the Allied invasion of Sicily. The public's faith shattered, and even Mussolini's own fascist Grand Council turned against him. On July 25, 1943, he was arrested by order of King Victor Emmanuel III, but the story did not end there. 2 months later, German commandos dramatically rescued him, and he was installed as the nominal head of the Italian Social Republic, RSI, a Nazi puppet state in the German-occupied North, often called the Salo Republic. This final phase was the darkest, most violent chapter of his reign, a civil war between fascist loyalists and the rapidly growing partisan resistance. Under the Salo Republic, the systematic persecution of Jews became direct and deadly. With German oversight, Italian authorities actively participated in rounding up Italian Jews for deportation to the extermination camps. You witnessed the horrifying event of October 16, 1943, in Rome, when over 1,000 Jews were arrested from the ancient ghetto, ultimately destined for Auschwitz. This compliance, this ultimate moral surrender to the Holocaust, stands as the deepest stain on the regime's history, a tragic consequence of the 1938 racial laws. In the North, the anti-partisan war devolved into a cycle of brutal repression and massacres. German troops, supported by newly formed fascist militias, the Black Brigades, employed a strategy of ruthless reprisals against civilians suspected of aiding the resistance. Incidents like the Marzabotto massacre, where hundreds of civilians were murdered in retaliation for partisan activities, show the complete loss of restraint. This final period was fascism at its most desperate and raw, inflicting immense harm on its own populace in a futile attempt to cling to power. The end came swiftly in April 1945. As the Allies advanced and the partisans rose in general insurrection, Mussolini attempted to flee, disguised among a column of retreating German soldiers. He was captured by communist partisans near Lake Como. The public execution of Mussolini, his mistress, Clara Petacci, and several other fascist leaders, followed by the display of their bodies in Milan's Piazzale Loreto, was a visceral release of 20 years of pent-up suffering. It was the definitive closure that marked the collapse of the fascist dream. The post-war reckoning in Italy was complex, often contradictory, and incomplete. While some high-ranking fascist officials were brought to trial, the scale of justice did not match the scale of the crimes. Many former black shirts and OVRA agents quietly returned to civilian life, or even continued their careers in government roles. This leniency, often shaped by the new Cold War priorities, led to a historical amnesia, where the full scope of fascist Italy's atrocities, particularly in the Balkans and Ethiopia, was left out of the national narrative for decades. Yet the structural legacy of the fascist regime lingered. The architecture of surveillance and centralized power, though rebranded, had shown how effectively a nation could be controlled. You see, the struggle in the decades that followed, the effort to reconcile the patriotic memory of the resistance with the brutal reality of a 20-year dictatorship. The scars of fascism remained not only in the cities but in the political and moral divisions that persisted, forcing Italians to reflect on the fragility of democracy. The lessons of Mussolini's rise and fall lie not only in the actions of one man, but in the environment that allowed him to grow. He showed that totalitarian power does not rise solely through brute force. It requires erosion of public discourse, myths of national greatness, and the dismantling of moral institutions. It requires people willing to trade liberty for a quick, temporary sense of order. The ease with which a modern nation abandoned its democratic foundations for a cult of personality remains a warning for any society facing turmoil. This video is created for educational and historical purposes. It examines themes of power, corruption, and human conflict, submarines without depicting explicit events. The focus remains on the systemic nature of totalitarianism and the psychological impact of unchecked authority across history. As the smoke clears from the Piazzale Loreto and the era of Il Duce closes, we are left with a serious paradox. Mussolini promised a revival of ancient strength and discipline, yet his rule ended in humiliation, economic collapse, and internal violence. The system he built to guarantee eternal power lasted only 2 decades, but the trauma lasted generations. We ask, is any society truly safe from the appeal of a strong man who promises stability by eliminating dissent? If this story made you reflect on how easily power turns to cruelty, stay with us. Subscribe for the next chapter from the darker corners of human history.